Your Grace, Reverend Fathers, brothers, sisters in Christ, it's a great joy to be here this afternoon. I have a long history with Holy Virgin Cathedral. After I was baptized in 1996, I made a pilgrimage out here when I was 18, and I remember coming into the cathedral. I grew up in South Florida, and we didn't have large Russian Orthodox cathedrals. I remember walking in. There was this very elderly bishop, it was Archbishop Andrei, with his auxiliary then, now Archbishop Kirill. And there was this huge deacon, he was the size of a bell, Deacon Nikolai. And I remember seeing this, and I went back to Florida. I said, I've just seen something so incredible. And I never thought I would end up moving out here, teaching at St. John's Academy for 3 years. And then when I got ordained, with the blessing of Archbishop Benjamin and Archbishop Kirill, I got probably the most practical hands-on liturgical training here. I did most of my 40 days as a deacon and a good portion of my first 2 weeks as a priest training here. So most of my mistakes were here too, liturgically. But I always feel I'm at home when I'm here, and it's a great joy to come back and give this lecture about Archbishop Andrei. I'm sure the question some of you might have is, why is a priest from the O.C.A. talking about our Archbishop? Who is he to speak about this? And the priest that baptized me was a disciple of Archbishop Andrei. And so from the very beginning of my acquaintance with Orthodoxy, my becoming a catechumen, I always learned about this clairvoyant elder, this disciple of the last Optina elders. And so I've had a devotion to Archbishop Andrei since I was probably about 17, and now I'm 46. I think he was a saint. And I think what happens in the church is the saints belong to all Orthodox Christians. We have so many people who come here to the relics of St. John, and they don't just come because he was a bishop in ROCOR. They come because he was a saint. And just as we go all over the world, we go to St. Nicholas, and no one says, well, you're not from Asia Minor, so who are you to be interested in St. Nicholas? Or now in our own church, we're about to glorify Martyrs Olga. I know many in ROCOR are interested in her life, and the saints kind of belong to all of us. And so that's sort of, so when I was asked by Father George to give this talk, he was really the obvious answer for someone who lived in America. So Archbishop Andrei Rymarenko, a bishop of the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia. He was the spiritual father of the late first hierarch of ROCOR, Metropolitan Philaret of thrice blessed memory. He was the founder, as you heard, of the Novo-Diveevo Women's Monastery in Spring Valley in New York. And he was a disciple of Elder Nektari of Optina, who was the last Optina elder to live there before the revolution, and was actually, well, we'll learn later, was kicked out by the Bolsheviks. He was born Adrian Adrianovich Rymarenko on March 15th or 27th, depending on which calendar you prefer, 1893 in Romny in the Poltava gubernia in the Russian Empire, which is now present-day Ukraine. He grew up in a wealthy but pious family of industrialists, and we have a good number of his writings, and he describes his childhood, which I will share with you. He opens this, and this comes from his address when he was consecrated as a bishop. And he said, I grew up in a pious family. I was surrounded by that Orthodox way of life which for generations had been created by Holy Russia. And our family life proceeded according to the church calendar, according to the yearly church cycle. Feast days were as if the signposts of life. At home, there were constant divine services, and not only molebens, but also all-night vigils. A strong impression was made on me by the early morning divine services, to which our mother took us, and to which we went, no matter what the weather, which is good to hear today with all the heat, no matter what the weather, fall and winter. After these divine services, one always felt a kind of extraordinary inspiration, a kind of quiet joy. Our family was wealthy, and the religious outlook with which our life was penetrated was naturally reflected in deeds as well. We participated in the building of churches, set out tables with food for poor people, sent donations to prisons, hospitals, and workhouses. Of course, there were also sorrows, and illnesses and deaths. But they also were accepted in the light of Christ. The awareness that Christ is risen and the life of man will be the resurrection of Christ helped us to bear our misfortunes and reverses. Everything was experienced lightly and joyfully, without the strains so characteristic of many people. This feeling of joy, this Christian way of life, were characteristic not only of our family, but also of the society which surrounded us. After the revolution of 1905, now Archbishop Andrei was only about 12 years old when that happened. And if you know Russian history, this is what Lenin called the dress rehearsal for the revolution of 1917. And that's a whole other talk about what happened in 1905. And nevertheless, he continues, after the revolution of 1905, in the place of hopes and agitations, there came disillusionment and desolation. People became, as it were, closed in on themselves. They were occupied with empty things, with little egoistic interests, visits, concerts, the theater. In human relations, dryness and officialness reigned. After completing his primary and secondary education in Romney, he moved to St. Petersburg to study at the Polytechnical Institute. And he actually also describes this period of his life as a kind of a period of searching. That joy from his childhood was sort of lost by the events of 1905 and following. He says, and I, attending the St. Petersburg Polytechnical Institute, coming up against this cold alienation, this desolation, for the first time experienced a close, if not to despair, then to despondency, and my soul cried out, I cannot. And why did my soul cry out? Why did this cry burst out, I cannot? I felt that I could not live as people around me were living. I felt that I was lacking that life, that Orthodox way of life, which had surrounded my childhood and youth, that lightness of heart which I felt. I had the impression that I had been deprived of the air which I had breathed. I had to have life, and I began to seek. The lectures on Dostoevsky of a certain professor revealed sides of life which I had somehow not recognized earlier. I became acquainted with a Christian student group, but this group did not satisfy me. It was interconfessional. But I, raised from childhood in the conditions of the Orthodox way of life, needed precisely the confessional way. I needed the sacraments, the feeling of sanctification, prayer. All this was given to me by Archpriest John Yegorov. He became the leader of a group of students who had left the Christian student group. And I spent 5 years in this school where there were 25 of us students. And for me, there was opened up the elemental reality of the life of Christ's church, by which Holy Russia lived. I understood that the divine services are not merely ritual, but that in them are revealed the dogmas of faith. They are the foundation of man's reception of divinity. Then the examination and study of the works of the fathers of the church and the patristic writings revealed to me the paths of life. When I had gone through the whole course taught by Father John, I had literally come back to life. I sensed the elemental power of orthodoxy. I sensed that breath of life which it gave. I understood in what this life consisted. I came to know that freedom of conscience which we receive through the sacrament of repentance. Now, it was during this time in the student group, that Adrian Rymarenko began to opt in a monastery, and there he encountered the elders Anatoly the Younger and Nektari. He describes his first visit. He said, I arrived at Optina Monastery on the day of Saints Peter and Paul at 6 o'clock in the morning, and stayed at the guest house with the wonderful monk Theodulus. He told Father Eustygnius, Father Anatoly's cell attendant, that I had come. Batushka immediately sent for me and blessed me to come to him after the liturgy. After the service, I immediately went to Batushka, and there was a whole crowd of people around his house. I was immediately let through and went to the elder. He was friendly and affectionate. In one moment, I completely forgot about what I had only just seen. Through his questions, the whole of my life was handed over to him. The conversation was mainly about my inner life. We talked about my pastorship, feeling my unworthiness. I asked the elder to forbid me to think of the priesthood, to which he, just like Elder Nectari later said to me, accept the priesthood without fail, otherwise you will suffer. When Batshka asked me about my life, he suddenly said to me, go to the holy things in the holy corner. There he began to read the prayers of confession. I thought that I would do confession, but Batshka summarized everything that I had said. I confirmed my sinfulness, and he read the prayer of absolution. And this was for me an unexpected prayer. I felt that I was reborn. Now, what's interesting about this quote is that if you talk to people who knew Archbishop Andrei, especially those who became priests, they had similar encounters. Probably one of the most recent story I heard was those of you who know Father Stefan Mahalik he's the priest at St. Nicholas Church in San Anselmo. He has a great voice, and he on the old St. Tikhon's records, he's often the deacon in the recordings. He tells the story of going to Novo-Diveevo just to venerate the portrait of St. Seraphim. He had no intention of seeing Archbishop Andrei, and suddenly Archbishop Andrei's clicking because says, the Archbishop will see you now. So they went and saw him, and then Archbishop he said, if you stay a deacon, the whole world will hear your voice, but you'll lose your soul. Go back and petition for ordination immediately. And it's simple like that. And so many that encounter with the elder was very similar to the encounters people had with him. In 1917, which is quite a year, Adrian Rymarenko graduated from the Polytechnical Institute with honors and returned to Romney, where he worked as a statistician in the Poltava province, a job which required him to travel around the villages and towns of the region. And there was an interesting thing that would happen. This was sort of a prophecy of his future episcopacy. It was the custom in the villages back then when the bishop arrived in the village, the bells started ringing. And they started noticing that in some of these villages, bells would sometimes just on their own start ringing. They said, one of you guys are going to be a bishop one day. Now, of course, it was also during this time that he met his wife, Yevgenia Grigorievna. I couldn't find a specific date of birth, but doing a little math from some of her reminiscence, I think she was either born in 1895 or 1896. And of course, they were married in either 1919 or 1920. I don't know. I couldn't find a specific date. She is also a very interesting woman. She was the daughter of a prominent landowner in the Poltava gubernia. She attended a women's college, first in St. Petersburg, and then later transferred to Moscow. After the death of her parents and after the 1917 revolution, she returned to her home city of Romney, where she met her future husband. And of course, he gave her books to read on the spiritual life. And she too became interested in Optina Monastery. I think one of the books was on the Banks of God's River by Sergei Nilus, which is a famous book about Optina. And she records her visit in April of 1919. She has a wonderful book that I don't know if it's still in print. The English version is published by Jordan. It's called Reminiscences, Recollections about Elder Nectaria of Optina by her. So if this is still available, I highly recommend reading if you want to know what these encounters were like at this really difficult time in the history of the church and in the history of Russia. Adrian Rymarenko was ordained to the diaconate on October 14th, 1921, and to the priesthood 3 days later by Archbishop Parthenius Levitsky of Poltava. He's a very interesting man because he actually oversaw one of the first Ukrainian language translations of the gospel. He was very much in favor of Ukrainian culture. However, at the same time, when the kind of first Ukrainian schisms developed after the revolution, he very much resisted those as well. Father Adrian and Matryoshka Evgenia had two sons. There was Seraphim, who was born in either 1920 or 1921, and Sergei, who was born in either 1924 or 1925. I had to basically find, well, he was this age this year, and I said, well, what part of the year is this in? So that's as far as we could get with those dates. His first pastoral assignment was to the St. Alexander Nevsky Cathedral in Romney. This, of course, was a very difficult time for the church in the newly formed Soviet Union. Elder Nectari the younger reposed a year later. And on Thomas Sunday of 1923, Optina Monastery was closed by the Bolsheviks. And from that time, Father Adrian and Matryoshka Yevgenia took up financial and food collections for Elder Nektari, who had settled in a village near the monastery. Father Adrian Nektari's counsels to him, which helped him to bear the many struggles and sorrows that lay ahead for him. He writes, after going through the frightful revolutionary years of 1917, 1918, and 1919, and when everything was collapsing and being destroyed, I came to a state which was simply pathological. Why fight when everything is coming to an end? My outlook was transmitted to my close ones. The revolution, the chaos, as it were, confirmed my words for those around me. I became a priest, but the conditions of my soul remained the same. And thus it was that I went to Optina, to the elder, with the question, what to do? The most important thing that Elder Nektari told me was, the Church of Christ goes, as it were, on a railroad track. The path of the rails is known, it is defined, but you and I must pay attention to what happens in the coach, which is on the rails. In the coach occurs the personal life of a man. A man goes in and out of the coach, and there will be an end to the rails. But the end of each person is separate. Each one leaves the coach earlier, another later, and here it is that Christian godliness is necessary. The dogmas of faith itself is revealed to us, and none of us doubts it. But the confession of faith must be in godliness. No one is good save God alone. This is to hold to what is God's in honor. It is the divine that must be our concern. It must enter into all sides of our life, personal, family, public. Godliness is disclosed to us by the daily divine services. At the daily midnight services, read the 17th Kathisma. That's Psalm 118, which is a disclosure of God's righteousness by the prophet David to his son Solomon. It's also the psalm that we read that takes a large portion of the beginning of the funeral service. And the church offers the 17th Kathisma in order to reveal our inward being. One of the methods for godliness is given by the Holy Church in a spiritual exercise which trains our mind to the remembrance of the name of God. Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on us. Monastics are given a prayer rope, but for a priest in the world, the prayerful remembrance of his spiritual children can serve for training in the remembrance of the name of God. And so, what to do? The elder said, live in such a way that what is God's will be an honor. And the chief thing is your mind, which must be in God. So this lifted him up. And we have one record of a parishioner at the Romney Cathedral who describes Father Adrian's ministry there. He says, it was in 1921 in Ukraine, in the Poltava province. It was a difficult time, a complete decline in spiritual life. Many were driven to despair. In one city located in a picturesque place, there was the Alexander Nevsky Church, which, like all the churches that remained open, was usually empty. Then a young priest began to serve there. He served with passion, and his sermons, in which the talent of an outstanding preacher immediately began to be revealed, ignited the hearts of those listening with the same fire that burned in the preacher himself. His church began to fill with people. Among these people, more and more monks from the already closed monasteries began to appear. In no other church could they find that aroma of spiritual life, that reverence for which they had left the world. Father Adrian served in Romney until 1926, when the cathedral was given over to Ukrainian schismatics. History is now repeating itself, unfortunately. This cathedral was later closed, and we know now that it was destroyed in 1962. Afterwards, he moved to Kiev. However, his successful ministry in Romney had already caught the attention of the atheist regime, which put him under the surveillance of the GPU, the State Political Directorate. And this is one of the forerunners of the KGB. Elder Nektari had told Father Adrian that he would face a great trial in Kiev. And Father Adrian actually describes one of his interrogations. He says that I was summoned to a meeting by the Chekists. This is another word. This is another precursor to the KGB, the secret police. They had a root cellar in a field there with a table and a lamp in it. They would do this to terrorize people. You had to walk down into a dark place. It was like a dungeon enclosed. I went down. There was a table with some papers on it. There was a man in spectacles sitting calmly at the table. I was taken down there by 2 or 3 others. The man looked up. He had been reading something, and he said, "Ah, Father Adrian, welcome, welcome. You're very welcome. You're a very special person. We've been wanting to meet you for a long time to have a friendly talk. You are a very well-known person, but you are often absent. You travel around. Perhaps you've been visiting Christians privately and celebrating services." They knew that I was a priest. They could have picked me up before, but hadn't. The interrogator said, "Oh, don't be nervous, Father. Don't be alarmed. We just wanted to have a friendly talk." I said to him right then, soberly, not angrily, but in a nice way, "Sir, I don't know your name, but whoever you are, let's be manly. Let's be straight. There can be no friendship between darkness and light, between atheists and believers. We can be civil, and we can be proper. Whatever you want to ask me, I'll give you straight answers. But let's forget about this friendly talk." Then I understood that the elder had meant what the elder had meant about the examinations. When the interrogator heard my answer, he said, "All right, if you want to have it your way, then we don't have to have a friendly chat." He pushed a paper towards me and said, "Sign it." Now, this was during a time where you denounced other people. They would come to you and they say, "We know you've been betraying the state, so you give us the names and we'll lighten your sentence. Sign these denunciations." I gently pushed it back and said, "I won't sign." He nodded to one of the people there, who pulled out a revolver and put it straight to my temple. "Sign," he said. I didn't answer. I closed my eyes tightly. I had a prayer rope that Elder Nectari had given me, and I said, "Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner," to myself. I expected them to shoot me. I don't know how long I was saying the Jesus prayer. I didn't hear a shot. I didn't hear anything. But I had said that I didn't want to have a friendly talk. When I had said that I didn't want to have a friendly talk, the interrogator had become quite upset and had pounded his fist on the table, kind of like Khrushchev used to, scattering the papers. After a while, I opened my eyes. The papers had all been straightened up nicely. He was sitting there and looking at me. The others were all standing around. I looked at them, and they looked at me. Silence. It was so quiet. I felt such calm. The interrogator said, "We know you're kind, and we'll get you. We'll get you like the others, and we'll get you using the law." Again, history is repeating itself in the same place right now. "We're watching you closely, and as soon as you transgress in the slightest, you will be picked up legally to be imprisoned and liquidated. Get out." Liquidated means shot, really. I left. I understood that things were even more serious now. I had to be more careful myself, and more careful not to get other people in trouble by visiting them or showing friendship. Until 1934, so for about 8 years, Father Adrian was unable to receive legal registration in Kiev. Does everyone understand what that means, registration? If you're from Russia or Ukraine, you know you have to be registered wherever you live. And that's part of when you're a tourist there, you can be in place for 3 days, and you have to be registered. If you're not, you can get in big trouble even to this day. So not being registered is a serious ordeal over there. So he was not able to get registration and thus carried out his priestly ministry secretly and lived illegally with friends. In April of 1928, Father Adrian received a postcard informing him that Elder Nectari was coming to the end of his earthly life, and he arrived at the elder's home on April 29th, 1928, the eve of his repose. He read the prayers for the departure of the soul over the elder, and we have actually an account of this, which I will share with you. Okay. Father Nectari was covered with a mantilla and lay half-turned towards the wall. There stood before his eyes an icon of St. Nicholas and an icon of his patron saint, St. Nectari, in a silver riza. On a small table beside the bed there lay a trebnik and an epitrachilion. In both rooms of that side of the house, candles were burning. The elder was breathing with difficulty. Maria Efimovna said sharply, "Read the prayers for the departure." Father Adrian put on the epitrachilion and began to read the prayers. He read slowly, glancing at him from time to time. It appeared that tears were flowing from the elder's eyes. He was looking at the icon. He was obviously conscious. When the prayers were ended, he was still breathing, but his breathing became slower and slower with long intervals. Father Adrian read the prayer of absolution and, kneeling, covered the face of the dying man with the mantilla. He continued to breathe for a long time after this, 40 minutes, or perhaps even an hour. His breathing was very soft with pauses, relates Father Adrian, but there came a moment when I sensed that these were his last breaths. And I arose and placed the epitrachilion over his head. I could see his mouth and neck. After a space of complete calm, a certain movement was noticeable in his throat. A smile appeared on his lips. This was his last breath. During all this time, Father Nectari was covered with the epitrachilion. When the elder died, I removed the epitrachilion from his head and closed his eyes, which were half opened. Maria Efimovna said to me with trepidation, "Batushka, how clairvoyant the elder was. You know, he began to die in front of me, and I wanted to remain entirely alone with him. But I remembered how back in January he said to me, 'Manya, call Father Adrian.' And when I explained that Father Adrian was not here, he replied categorically, 'Call him.' They've taken him to the other side of the house. I remembered this just now and began to tremble at the thought that I was violating the elder's will and called you in. As soon as they opened the door of the room, an agent of the GPU appeared and confiscated Father Adrian's documents. The local priest, Father Tikhon, was summoned, and he and Father Adrian prepared the body to be vested. The next day, early in the morning, Father Tikhon left to prepare for the liturgy while Father Adrian remained to read the gospel over Elder Nectari, which he read without interruption until 8 o'clock Sunday evening, when the first group of people began to arrive from Kozelsk, Moscow, and Smolensk. In 1930, Father Adrian was arrested. However, due to an illness, he was released. It's also said that the interrogator who was supposed to shoot him himself got arrested by the Chekists. They often picked on each other too. And so it was through much prayer that he survived a possible liquidation, as they called it. After receiving legal registration in 1934, he was officially assigned rector of the St. Nicholas Church in Kiev. This is a very interesting church because it sits above the resting place of Prince Askold, who is mentioned in the primary chronicle. The same year, this church was closed and turned first into a restaurant and then into a park pavilion. And then in 1997, the church was restored and unfortunately transferred to the Ukrainian Catholic Church. So he keeps losing churches and having they get handed over to the wrong people. In 1935, he was assigned to the Church of St. Panteleimon in the Kurnivka region of Kiev. But with the purges that began in 1936, Father Adrian again had to go into hiding and minister secretly. He experienced several years of wandering, moving from city to city, performing secret services and rituals, constantly risking both his freedom and his very life. With the German occupation of Kiev in 1941, Father Adrian was again able to live and minister more openly. He became a spiritual father at the Holy Protection Women's Monastery in Kiev. During that time, he also created a home for the elderly and disabled, and he actually even founded a hospital. He was not spiritually abandoned. He came under the spiritual direction of Archbishop Anthony Abashizde. I can't pronounce Georgian last name, sorry. This man has been glorified by the canonical Ukrainian Orthodox Church. He was glorified in 1912. Not 1912, 2012. And Archbishop Anthony is revered as a great ascetic, a man of prayer, and a clairvoyant elder. There's an interesting story about Archbishop Anthony, that he was the inspector of the Tbilisi Theological Seminary during the expulsion of a seminarian named Yosef Yugashvili, also known as Stalin. And it's said that despite the expulsion, the Archbishop was very kind to this former seminarian, and which he remembered. And that's the reason why, even though he lived in this time, he was never arrested or imprisoned or executed, because Stalin would say, no, not. He was nice to me. Leave him alone. In 1942, on the Feast of Pascha, Father Adrian was awarded the mitre by Bishop Panteleimon of Lvov. And in 1943, Father Adrian was appointed as a spiritual father for other clergy. That's often what happens. I don't know how every diocese works, but some dioceses actually insist that there are a few priests that other priests are assigned to confess to, and he was one with that authorization. He also served in a diocesan organization that assisted clergy in their material needs, and he taught at the Kiev Theological Seminary. In autumn of 1943, Father Adrian fled Kiev with many of his other faithful, among whom was Oleg Kontsevich, the future Bishop Nektari, the auxiliary bishop for this diocese for many years. And when he got to Germany, he was assigned to the Holy Resurrection Cathedral in Berlin. At that time, the cathedral was under the jurisdiction of the Russian Church abroad. Interestingly, one of the other clergymen attached to the cathedral during this time was Father George Bennigsen, who was a rector at our parish in Berkeley for 1 year, and he was quite a beloved priest on the Diocese of the West for the Metropolitan for the O.C.A. So shows we're all kind of connected. From that time, and possibly from the moment when Father Adrian became the de facto dean of the cathedral, by order of Metropolitan Seraphim, the life therein changed dramatically. The cathedral stopped limiting its opening to only certain days and times for services and became a 24-hour center for providing assistance and care. In the basement of the cathedral, they fed many refugees and exiles, some of whom were illegally passing through Berlin. Father Adrian never asked to see their papers. And they pretty much would help anyone in need. Likewise, the divine services were served daily, both morning and evening, and taking into account the malebens and the various needs of people and the memorial services, it was practically there were services going on continuously in the cathedral. The soul of all this, recalled another priest of the cathedral, was the prayerful and wise priest, Father Adrian. Beginning in late November of 1943, Berlin was subjected to severe air raids and bombings. However, Father Adrian continued his ministry in the cathedral and to his flock. After one liturgy in 1945, a miracle occurred. Due to bombings, it became impossible for anyone to leave the cathedral. Father Adrian called for calm and began to serve a moleben to the Most Holy Theotokos before the miraculous Pachayev icon. At the beginning of the moleben, the bombs caused a loss of electrical power. Later, other bombs exploded closer, causing some of the cathedral's windows to shatter. So as they're praying, it's almost like they're being rained on by broken glass. And then, of course, the chandelier began to sway back and forth, and it was in danger of falling down and killing people. At the end of the moleben, Father Adrian stood on the ambon and said, "Move back to the walls, the chandelier could break and kill you." Yet one of the congregants answered, "No, we will stay here. The Most Holy Lady will protect us with her holy omophorion." Everyone remained where they were, praying to the Mother of God and the saints. Father Adrian preached about the remembrance of death and comforted his flock. Then, after a long darkness, the electric candles lit up the walls, the icon of the Mother of God began to shine with an ineffable light, and the entire church grew brighter, and the bombings gradually abated. And what's very miraculous about this is that the bombings had destroyed the entire area around the cathedral. Everything was destroyed. Only these pious people in the cathedral and the cathedral itself was spared. During his time in Germany, Father Adrian endured what may have been the worst trial of his life, and this is recorded in Father Damascene Christensen's biography of Father Seraphim Rose. I know we just talked about Father Seraphim, but there's a good amount of material in, if it's ever a copy or if it's reprinted one day, there's a good amount of material in that biography about Father Adrian or Archbishop Andrei. Father Damascene writes, "It had been Father Adrian's lot to endure terrible traumatic experiences together with his flock. During World War II, shrapnel from a bomb had torn off half of his son, Seraphim's head right before his eyes. So he saw the death of the son in such a horrible way right before his eyes. Father Adrian accepted this suffering wisely, using the knowledge gained by it to help and console people, and they clung to him. As a priest, father, confessor, and orator, he attracted many hundreds of people to his church services and way of life. In 1945, he moved to southern Germany and served in a church near Stuttgart in Wendlingen. And during this time, he helped many refugees avoid deportation to the Soviet Union. This was also something that the late Metropolitan Vitali, when he was a priest, he saw that many, because of course, the Soviet Union wanted all their citizens who were in Central and Western Europe back, and that could be a catastrophe if that happened. They often sent you straight to gulags. So making sure people were not sent back was a major work of Father Adrian. In 1949, he immigrated to the United States, where he founded the Novo-Diveevo Women's Monastery, a community which at one point grew to 50 nuns. Orthodox Rus, a official publication of ROCOR, issue number 18 from September 15th, 1949, reported on the arrival in New York of the former rector of the Berlin Cathedral during the war, martyred Archpriest Adrian Rymarenko, with his wife and son. This is Sergei, his younger son. The report also indicated that after the end of World War II, Father Adrian founded in the state of Württemberg a church community of like-minded people with a semi-monastic communal charter, which he headed for about 4 years. Part of his community had already moved to America. Part was on its way. Almost immediately upon arriving in the United States, the Holy Synod blessed him to establish the Novo-Diveevo Women's Monastery and appointed him as the spiritual father of the community. In 1968, 5 years after the death of his wife, Yevgenia Grigorievna, he was tonsured a monastic, taking the name Andrei, and that same year he was consecrated a bishop. And in 1973, he was raised to the rank of Archbishop. He reposed in the Lord on July 12th, 1978, and we have I managed to find our own little collection issue of the Orthodox Word, which describes his repose. The last day of the life of Bishop Andrew was the feast of the holy leaders of the apostles Peter and Paul. Interesting, that's the same. He arrived at Optina all those years ago on that same feast day, where the beginning of his spiritual life was there. It was hot summer weather. He received communion as usual on all Sundays and feast days with reverence. He was very weak and lay there surrounded by people devoted to him, anticipating the long-awaited hour. Every day he would listen to 3 acathist. First to the Vladimir icon of the Mother of God, which was read by Mother Nona, one to St. Nicholas, which was read at noon, and one to St. Seraphim, which was read in the evening. All the services were transmitted to him from the church by microphone, so that he was with everyone in spirit all the time. In the evening, towards the end of Matins, my elder was praying especially intensely to the Mother of God, taking out a small icon which his mother had given him and which he always had with him. That day, he was praying before it especially strongly and for a long time, as if he were gathering all his strength. This was sensed by all. Suddenly, he began to hemorrhage. His son, Sergei, and Father Alexander Kiselov jumped up. Brother Michael was at that time reading the Akathist to the Vladimir icon of the Mother of God. Then the bishop began to summon everyone in order to say farewell to all and to give them his last testament, repeating that he was dying and asked everyone's prayers for him. He began especially forcefully to cry out, "Most Holy Theotokos, save us." And he uttered other prayers as well. When he broke out in a cold sweat, he cried out, "I'm dead," and instantly grew pale and became white as snow. Father Alexander came to the adjoining room to grab the epitrachelion, the very one under which the elder Nectaria had died when Father Adrian was holding it 50 years earlier. But the bishop had already left our world. It was on this very day of Saints Peter and Paul. That day he walked into Optina Monastery for the time, and now he was entering the other world. It was half an hour before midnight. The bells were rung, and all the nuns in black silhouette gathered for prayer and quietly began to sing the 90th Psalm to begin the Panikhida. Thus ended the apostolic life of the contemporary elder of Christ, Andrew. So there's a question is, what would Archbishop Andrei have to say to us today? And really a wonderful summary is written in a 1976 issue of the Orthodox Word, which was dedicated to him. And they summarize his teachings thus. And if you really want to get a full, I don't know if this book is still in print, but there's this wonderful book called The One Thing Needful that was published by St. John of Kronstadt Press, which contains his Sunday homilies. And so if you want to learn more about his teachings that are at least available in English, this is the book you want to get. But to summarize these teachings, first, orthodoxy is not merely a ritual or a belief or pattern of behavior or anything else that a man may possess, thinking that he is hereby a Christian and still be spiritually dead. Rather, it is an elemental reality or power which transforms man and gives him the strength to live in the most difficult and tormenting conditions and prepares him to depart with peace into eternal life. Second, the essence of the true Orthodox life is godliness or piety, which is in the definition of Elder Nectari based on the etymology of the word, holding what is God's in honor. This is deeper than mere right doctrine. It is the entrance of God into every aspect of life lived in fear and trembling of God. Third, such an attitude produces the Orthodox way of life, which is not merely the outward customs or behavior that characterizes Orthodox Christians, but the whole of the conscious struggle of the man for whom the Church and its laws are the center of everything he does and thinks. The shared conscious experience of this way of life, centered on the daily divine services, produces the genuine Orthodox community with its feeling of lightness, joy, and inward quietness. Non-Orthodox people and even many not fully conscious Orthodox Christians are scarcely able to conceive what this experience of community might be and would be inclined to dismiss it as something subjective. But no one who has wholeheartedly participated in the life of a true Orthodox community, monastic or lay, will ever doubt the reality of this Orthodox feeling. When Archbishop Andrei tells of his lifelong and successful search to find and even create the lost quietness of his Orthodox childhood, he expresses the desire of everyone who has drunk deeply of Holy Orthodoxy to find the place, create the conditions, and acquire the state of soul wherein to live the full and authentic Orthodox life, one in mind and soul with other similar strugglers. Even if this ideal is seldom attained and practiced, it still remains the Orthodox ideal. Fourth, without a conscious and constant spiritual struggle, even the best Orthodox life or community can become an artificial atmosphere in which the outward manifestations of Orthodox life are merely enjoyed or taken for granted, while the soul remains unchanged, being relaxed and comfortable instead of engaged in the struggle for salvation. Everything depends on the state of the soul, which must be trembling before God, having the law of God before it in every area of life, every moment, keeping what is God's in honor in the first place of life. And fifth and finally, the greatest danger to the Orthodox way of life in modern times is what Father Andrew calls humanism, which for him encompasses the whole vast intellectual and now political movement, which has as its ultimate aim to destroy Christianity and replace it with a this-worldly, rationalistic philosophy in which man, in effect, becomes a god unto himself. The manifestations of humanism are many, from the Renaissance in the West to the brazen atheism and revolutions of the 18th century, to communism, to every other philosophy in our own day, which places the ultimate value in this world and leads men away from God. Humanism takes possession of men in various ways, not usually by a conscious intellectual conversion to it, but more by laxness and unawareness in spiritual life. The Orthodox answer to this danger, whose ultimate end is the reign of Antichrist, is a conscious Orthodox philosophy of life. Thank you very much.